Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live. My name is Amardeep Modi, Vice President at Everest Group. My work involves working closely with enterprise buyers and technology providers across data automation, AI markets. It's really great to have all of you with us today. And before we get started, let's hear where are you tuning in from today. Share your city or country in the comments. We'd love to see where everyone is joining us from. Uh, yeah, let's see if we are getting any comments yet. But I'm sure we are getting people from all over the world. Um, Today, we are talking about context engineering and why it is becoming so important for everyone. Enterprises have invested heavily in data foundations, governance, AI models, and now agentic platforms. But even with all of that investment, AI systems often still don't fully understand how an enterprise actually works. They may have access to data, but not always the meaning behind it, the policies, the exceptions, relationships, institutional logic, decision logic that people use every day to get the work done. And as models and agentic capabilities become more widely available, the real differentiation is not going to be about, hey, which model is better, model one or model two, should we go for model three? It's really going to be about the quality of the enterprise context that is available to those models. That context could be the bridge between AI that today mainly assists us and the employees, and AI that can reliably support decisions and actions at scale, which is what enterprises are striving for. To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by two amazing colleagues, Ross and Mansi. Ross, would you like to go first and briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm an amazing colleague of Amar who leads our our CIO practice. So in this webinar, I'll be representing more of a buy side of technology. I spent about 25 years in technology, loved every one of them, working for Everest Group and McKinsey and Company.
Thanks, Ross. Mansi, over to you for a quick introduction.
Yes. Thank you, Amar. Hi, everyone. I'm Mansi Gupta. I'm a practice director in the data and AI team here at Everest Group. Since the past 5 years at Everest Group, I've been tracking multiple data and AI tech and services markets. And before this, also, I was involved in some of the implementation areas.
Thanks, Mansi. It's great to have both of you here. Before we jump into a discussion, I have one more question for everyone in our audience today. What does context mean to you? Please just drop your answers in few words in the comment section. And there is no right or wrong answer. So just feel free to share top of mind thoughts. It could be ontologies, business rules, policies, processes, or something completely different. Let's see if we are getting any interesting comments. I think there is a bit of a lag from when people post comments to when I get it. So we'll move on. And the context can look very different depending on whether you're approaching it from a business, data, technology, or decision making perspectives. So I'm expecting some different set of answers when I ask this question to a wide variety of audience. So with that, let's get into a discussion. Let's unpack this topic of context engineering. So, Ross, let me start with you. From a CIO or CDO perspective, why is context engineering becoming urgent now? Is this really becoming a board room level issue, or is it still mainly a technical architecture discussion?
Sure. Well, as of now, it's one of the major drivers of business value. Please note I said as of now. I actually don't expect it to stay that way for a long time. It may not be the major driver in the future. There's a lot of innovation happening already around context. All the major providers realize the importance. So there are a variety of technologies emerging around context capture, context sharing, storing, etc. So there's no doubt that as of today, it can have profound effect on how much value we deliver to the business. However, the media and quite honestly, our industry tends to exaggerate. I don't think it's a board level value issue on a simple premise that 80% of your board will not understand what the hell are you talking about when you bring up the context engineering. It's a technology issue in my mind. It's a technology issue because AI needs it. People don't. If I want to ask my colleague Mansi a question, which we do often, I don't have to give her 20 minutes of context. I'll just say I am a enterprise IT leader and I have a question, right? That's all she needs, not with AI, right? We will need to provide long context of where we're coming from and what we're trying to achieve. So people don't need it. However, its importance is definitely beyond just technical architecture at a minimum because it affects business directly. So my reaction to this question, yes, it's a head of AI issue. It's probably chief digital officer issue. It's likely CIO issue. It's not a board issue.
No, no, thanks, Ross, for sharing your perspectives, and that's I think a really good way of framing it. That context engineering is very important for business. It impacts it directly. It's a CIO issue. It's a CDO issue. May not be a boardroom issue as of yet, but that just shows that how important it has become for enterprises to get real value out of their AI investments. But before we get further into why it becomes such an important topic, I think it's important to first better understand what context engineering is all about, right? So, Mansi, let's go there, right? When we say context engineering, what exactly are we talking about? Should enterprises think of the context layer as a new enterprise control pane, or should it remain distributed across the systems and platforms they already use?
So when people hear context engineering, they sometimes assume that it's just a more sophisticated version of prompt engineering or RAG. I think that definition is a little too narrow. The way I like to look at it is from the lens of where enterprise agents really are today. We talk a lot about autonomous agents, but in cases the implemented agents are still just assistants. They can find information, they can summarize it, and maybe complete a well defined task. But when the situation becomes complex, sensitive, or high stakes, a person usually has to be brought back in to step in and take the decision. And that's not only because the model needs to become smarter, it's because the model does not yet understand how the enterprise really works. For example, if you have an experienced employee and you ask them to make a decision, just like Ross was saying, they don't just open a policy document and execute it end to end. They consider the past decisions and exceptions and approvals and then make an informed decision. We have given agents access to these data sets, but not to the years of experience sitting in people's heads. And that's the context problem I think we are dealing with. In an ideal world, a context layer would stitch the different types of knowledge an enterprise already has. It could be documents, metadata, vectors, semantics, and so on, and then tie it with business logic. So, how decisions are made, exceptions, or tribal knowledge. Because of so many components involved, the context is currently scattered across the ecosystem, and many times it's not even documented. And the real value only comes from bringing these different forms of context together for the specific task that's in front of the agent. Now, of course, it's much easier for me to say this here and much more complex to implement in real life. So, to the question that whether it should be a control plane or distributed, I don't think that's a binary choice. A unified layer, it can offer consistency, it can create common definitions, policies, and without that consistency, two agents could look at the same situation and arrive at completely different answers. But trying to centralize every piece of context could easily become another multi-year enterprise transformation exercise. It could be slow, it could be expensive, and sometimes even disconnected from the needs of individual domains. So a distributed approach, it can be closer to workflow, but if every domain builds its own context independently, enterprises will risk recreating the same silos that they're trying to remove. So I would not describe the future context layer as one giant enterprise brain. It would be probably more like an enterprise nervous system. the knowledge and intelligence can still remain distributed, but there will have to be a supporting central spine with some common signals, shared rules, and mechanisms that allow the right context to be assembled when a decision is being made. And how well can an enterprise implement this? That will determine whether agents remain helpful assistants or begin to operate more autonomously.
No, absolutely. I think that's a very important point, Mansi, that hey, it's not really talking, we are not talking about one tool or one large centralized platform. It may be a broader capability that connects enterprise meaning and decision logic across several different systems, right? But it's really important to not make it another, a silo issue of related to context, right? That hey, different silos of context start existing across enterprise. It's really important to make sure that all of those kind of come together in order to provide a more unified access of context to the AI systems. Okay, great. So once leaders understand what context engineering represents, I think the next question is naturally about the business case, right? Why should anyone care about it, right? Really, right? Um, every new layer of enterprise technology promises value, right? So one would question that, hey, is it just another layer like this, right? How to really understand the business case, right? Because it can bring additional cost, integration work, governance requirements, and a lot of complexity. So, Ross, my next question is for you, and this is really a problem, a dilemma that CIOs and CTOs face today, right? With any new technology layer. So, in the context of context engineering, is it really a value unlock or an architectural tax? How are enterprise leaders likely to evaluate that trade-off when it comes to this topic?
Hmm. Well, if you've been in technology long enough, you would realize quickly that every technology eventually becomes an architectural tax. If you look at great things like cloud, DevOps, CI/CD, right? It was a source of a value unlock and competitive advantage for companies like Spotify, right? Which managed to out innovate others early. But over time, I would argue it has become a tax. If you look at cloud, the cost per unit is actually higher than the data center. Well, if your data center is well virtualized, right? So in a way, cloud has already become a tax on the architecture of IT. Very few technologies, if any, become never-ending source of unlock and competitive advantage. So keep in mind, if it's not an architectural tax today, it will become one soon, right? And it's not just semantics, right? You do need to evaluate where you are in this journey. If you look at employee productivity, at AI in employee productivity, everybody's using it to draft emails, generate summaries, occasionally generate pictures of kittens and puppies, right? So it's already there. I would argue it's already a tax. Investing in capturing all that context makes no sense. But if you look at a corporate agentic platform, the knowledge of the company, and that's actually one of the comments from one of the gentlemen here, that it's a tribal knowledge of your company that will be captured, right? That becomes truly a source of value, an unlock of the value. So assess where you are in the AI journey. Keep in mind that it might be an unlock now, it will become an architecture tax, and this should drive your decisions.
No, absolutely. I think I really like that, correlation with tribal knowledge. And I think that makes a lot of sense, Ross, what you shared. I think it can
Wasn't
become a
me
tax.
actually, it's Abideep, one of our guests mentioned that, and I really like that definition. It's
No,
really
absolutely,
significant.
absolutely, and I agree, and it can become a tax when the investment is disconnected from an actual business problem, and that's what is happening with a lot of newer technologies that where a lot of hype gets created, right? But it can unlock real value when it improves a specific decision, workflow, and outcome. So I think that's what enterprises need to do. However, even when the business case is clear, making this work in practice isn't always easy, right? I think I was just looking at one interesting question from one of the folks who have joined us. Can your AI learn this context from employee interaction and prompt? So it's all about, okay, context is important. How do you operationalize it, right? So I think some part of it will also get covered in the next question that I have. So I think today enterprises already have many technology components in place, right? Data platforms, metadata tools, retrieval systems, knowledge graphs, ontologies, and whatnot. So, what makes context engineering difficult to operationalize, right? Is the harder part a technology or the ownership model behind it? So, Mansi, that's my question to you. Would you like to, share your perspectives around, why it is becoming hard to, just operationalize context?
Yeah, so the technology problem is hard, but in my opinion, the operating model that's needed to make it successful is even harder. So the technology problem is at least visible. Enterprises know that they need to connect documents, they need to connect data, metadata, graphs, and all of that, right? And that they need to make sure that this context is delivered to an agent at the right time. Making this possible technologically is not an easy engineering task, but at least it's visible and tangible. The operating model, in my opinion, is harder because it exposes questions the enterprises may have lived with for years without ever resolving. So what is the right definition, who's the right approver, what's the right source? If we take something as simple as whether a supplier is approved, the procurement team may consider the supplier approved once commercial checks are complete. Finance may require a banking validation. Risk and sustainability teams may have a separate definition altogether. And within each of these functions, those definitions may make sense. But now, if an agent has to decide whether to onboard the supplier or release a purchase order, the problem is no longer finding the supplier record. It's about understanding which definition of approved applies to this particular decision, whether an exception is allowed, and so on and so forth, right? And this is not simply a technology decision, it's an operating model decision. The second challenge could be that the context that an agent needs, it might not be formally documented. And that's the point around tribal knowledge, right? It's tribal, it's in people's heads, it's not documented. So context engineering is also about capturing and institutionalizing that judgment and making it usable by an AI system. And then there's the concept of freshness. Context is not static, it has a shelf life. Policies change, rules change, regulations change. For example, your navigation system, it can have an accurate map, but if today the road is closed and it does not know it, then it will still mess up. Same is true for an agent. The context may be broadly correct, but wrong for this particular moment. And there was a comment in the chats around that as well. It should be relevant at this moment. And an agent acting on an outdated rule, it can create a huge, substantial business risk. The crux being that just choosing a technology platform is not enough. To create the value, it requires a strong operating model which is built around the decision the agent is supposed to take. Multiple teams will have to collaborate and take accountability, but that also does not mean that the answer is to create one giant central committee reviewing every action. Otherwise, every agent decision will be waiting for committee reviews and internal meeting alignments. And needed is probably a clear ownership across the processes so that context is not just an interesting architecture and an actual dependable capability for agents.
No, absolutely. I think that point about ownership is especially important, right? Technology may only be one part of the challenge, right? Someone still has to capture the knowledge, maintain it, keep it current, and decide whether it can be trusted. Once an enterprise understands what it needs to operationalize, it then has to decide how much of that capability it should create itself, purchase from the market, or consume from the platforms it already uses, right? So, Ross, how should CIOs think about build versus buy versus platform native context? Are these situations where a different model makes sense?
that's where my answer will get very biased. And I'd like to acknowledge this bias because my bias is around lock in, which I would argue is one of the worst things that can happen to you when you use technology. If you don't believe me, look at your SaaS spend. Look at how it progressed over the last decade. Look at how it has grown. Look at your last negotiations where you had so little leverage left because of lock in. So, where I'm going with this, whatever you do today should ensure that you have control over this very important functionality and you don't get locked in early. That's why I'm biased toward building it. I understand building it may not be in the books for some folks, right? Requires expertise, requires managerial commitment. It's just not easy. The second best in my mind is having a service provider build it for you. Lock-in happens with service providers too, but it's actually easier to manage than with a platform because there are kind of well-known methods like right to hire in your contract, which allows you to get the best SMEs kind of attracted to your own team, or things like building team from the start as your own so-called virtual capability center. Right? There are methods of working with service providers that ensure that you have control of whatever comes out of that collaboration. The last one in my mind is jumping on a SaaS platform very early in the game because that's the lock-in that is the strongest by far. And buying a platform or jumping on it will definitely lock you in. And to me, that's one of the main things to avoid early in the game. So that's my biased opinion, right? Build, ask somebody else to do it. If it's completely impossible, start looking at the platforms. It doesn't mean that eventually you will not end up on a platform. This often happens too. It's just doing it very early in the game. There's a lot of danger.
No, absolutely. I think, I completely agree. And I think from my perspective, it's really about understanding, in which situations, build would make more sense versus buy would make more sense. But I think the leadership decision is really about where speed and standardization matter more, and where enterprise control and differentiation matter more, right? And as you rightly mentioned, there are ways to work with service providers where enterprises can still retain the control that they need to, because of the strategic nature of the context engineering layer that we're talking about. Okay, I think we are all seeing how important this topic has become, and that also explains why so many providers are trying to establish a position in the market, which is making the space very crowded. So, Mansi, to help enterprise leaders make sense of this madness, could you share how provider landscape is actually evolving, and who is best positioned to capture value in this context layer?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. The market is definitely noisy, it's crowded because context platform or context management, it's not yet a settled category that everyone has agreed upon. It's really a convergence point. A lot of the data and AI providers, tech providers, service providers, they're all approaching context from different starting points. And each provider, it tends to define context around the asset it already owns. Sometimes that represents a genuine expansion of the product, and sometimes it's the same capability with a new context sticker on the box. So rather than getting too caught up in the label, I think it's more important to check which job in the entire context lifecycle does a provider actually perform. And in the landscape, currently there are multiple motions emerging. One could be around assembling the context. So data and AI platforms, retrieval platforms, they are well positioned here. They sit close to structured data, documents, infrastructure. Their natural advantage is helping the agent access the relevant information at the right time. Another motion could be around business meaning and relationships. This is where semantic models, ontologies, knowledge graphs, they become important. They help an agent understand not just the individual pieces of information, but how those pieces relate as well. Another category I'm seeing is around trust. This is where governance, catalog, metadata capabilities, they all have an advantage. They help establish ownership, lineage, even freshness and versioning, right? They help answer not only what information did the agent find, but where did it come from? Is it current? Does the user have access to it? And all of that. There's also this part where the context has to be put inside the processes. So enterprise application platforms and workflow platforms, I think there was a comment also around it about these domain specific context layers. All of these have an advantage here because they sit close to the actual business process and have a lot of process knowledge, which is important for this process. And service providers, they cut across the life cycle because context is not just a software installation that you can buy and implement. Someone still has to tie the processes and the pieces together and make it work. So I don't think there will be one clear winner because there are too many fragments. And this also does not mean that the enterprises should wait for one platform to do everything. For the foreseeable future, context will still be scattered across multiple systems and providers. And enterprise should focus on which part of the context ecosystem can a particular provider help with and go beyond just the marketing labels.
No, thanks, Mansi, for sharing those insights. It's clearly, still a very open and fragmented market, right? And different providers control different parts of the journey, as you mentioned. But no one consistently owns the full path from enterprise context to decision and action. It's an evolving market, early stages in its very early stages in its maturity. For enterprise leaders, that means questions around interoperability, platform concentration, and lock-in may be just as important as capabilities of an individual product, right? And that also relates to the build versus buy question that I think we tried to address earlier, right? So I think it's a very I think important topic. We have covered a lot of ground today, from the execution of context operationalization of context to the architecture to the business case operating model, some of the sourcing choices and platform, and the provider landscape. So, let's close with the top three takeaways for enterprise leaders from today's discussion. So, Ross, let's start with you. What is the one takeaway you would leave with CIOs and CTOs?
Mhm. I'd like to acknowledge that context engineering is one of the probably key determinants of the AI success today. It does have potential to differentiate in the short run, and it will become an important architectural aspect in the long run. But remember, your approach will evolve. You need to start with basic considerations how to avoid lock in, ensure control over whatever you're building, and just don't get overwhelmed with all the cheerleading around AI. It's another important technology build up that we've done so many times and will do this time too.
No, absolutely. And Mansi, what is the one takeaway you would leave with the leaders?
Context is not just another data project. It's not a technical project. It's the combination of enterprise knowledge and business logic. So you have to start with a decision or workflow and then work backwards instead of trying to build an enterprise wide context layer. And you can expect context to remain distributed. Some elements would be shared across the enterprise while some would stay close to the domain. What matters is having those common standards so that your models and agents, they are more fluent and the context is more dependable on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And let me add one final takeaway, right? So I would say that people should not just jump into it just because everyone is talking about it. People should take a step back, they should really understand, hey, what is the business problem that they're trying to solve with it, right? And identify a specific use case, and then try it out, right? Where they're looking to scale AI from assistance to, let's say, an AI that helps make decisions or take actions, right? And see what requires to kind of make context work for an AI system in that use case. So that means asking a lot of questions, right? What does the AI system need to understand to do this well? Where does that knowledge sit today? Which policies, relationships, past decisions and business exceptions matter? How often, does it change? And also a mechanism to track that how better context has actually improved the outcome. So I think once some of these questions are answered, I think enterprises would be in a better position to really, take their context investments from, one use case where they're piloting it to, more enterprise wide and more strategic, where they're able to implement AI systems that, in a scalable fashion are able to, scale from assistance to, more autonomous systems. And that's not going to happen in every use case. So enterprises will have to be a bit more selective about making some of these investment choices. So I think for the audience today, we also have um, access to a blog that we have written on context engineering. You can see a QR code on the top right corner of your screen. So you can scan it, access this blog where you will find some more in-depth insights around context engineering, how we see the platform evolve, what should be the key functions of a context engineering platform, more deeper insights into, it's a provider landscape, different segments of providers who are building context capabilities. So check it out, and you can also request a meeting with the analysts in case you have any questions, and we would be happy to address some of those questions. Now, Ross and Mansi, thank you both. This has been a really insightful conversation. And thank you everyone who joined us today. But before we close, we would like to leave you with one final question. Right? Which important decision or workflow in your organization is data rich, but still context poor? I think the question itself will help you understand that it's not about data. It's about something much more than data. So, would love to kind of see what kind of answers are coming up in the chat, but you can also share
I
your
like,
answers over to us. Sorry, Ross, you were saying?
Mark, we have a minute. There's actually really awesome questions coming in. I'd like to
Yeah, absolutely.
not answer
Absolutely.
them, at least acknowledge some of them. Leonard, you asked a good question. Can AI learn the context from employee interaction? And I'm very skeptical. I mean, the last question I asked of the Everest Enterprise AI subscription was who's going to win in the World Cup? I didn't like the answer, by the way. Where am I going with this? That's probably one of the noisiest sources. It does contain tribal knowledge, but I would say context should be built, at least initially, from much more reliable sources. And that throws me into really good question from Pratik, which is how do you avoid context rot, right? Everything has a lifespan and data will rot over time. What levers can be tweaked to actually provide, to avoid that issue? Look, I repeated your question not because I can answer it in the next 30 seconds, but because it's a really, really good question and a concern to keep in mind. If you folks are interested, that would be the example of a question you ask of an analyst that Amar asked earlier, right? We have that way of collaborating. Certainly there are levers and they need to be engaged, right? I'm going to go back to my colleagues. Are there any questions you would like to pick up from the comments that we received?
Yeah, I think not really a question, but I think more of a comment, right? So this goes to the first question that I asked you, Ross, around context engineering becoming a boardroom topic for or not, right? And I think there is a comment from Marco here which says that, hey, it's a boardroom topic every time AI is a boardroom topic, right? So they go hand by hand. So would love to kind of hear what you have to say on that, Ross.
Marco, I'd like to say you have very advanced board that you're dealing with. Congratulations. That's actually a really good news. My joke about it was mostly this is a very difficult topic. Board gives you directional guidance, right? I wouldn't ask board to help with such a deep technical arguments. That's why I said it's probably not the question you bring to the board. The question you bring to the board is the value of AI, right? And if context engineering is one of the things that drive it, they need to have directional guidance on it, probably in a form of budget, right? In a form of commitment. But yeah, you making a good point. If AI is already a board topic, this becomes one of the bullet points on it.
Absolutely. Okay, let's see if we have time for maybe one more question. I think I'm seeing a couple of comments which relates context to memory, right? So Mansi, would you like to share some perspectives? How do you distinguish between context and memory?
Yeah, so context is something I don't think it can be created at that particular moment or at that particular point. And I think it relates to that previous question that we were talking about, can AI learn over time? So that is the important distinction, because context is something that AI will keep having to learn. And then the question on context rot also relates to that, because context can get outdated very soon. You have to create it for the broader process instead of for that particular moment or that particular memory decision. So that would be an important part. And then things like versioning, making sure that which source is trustworthy versus marking a source as untrustworthy, even having feedback going back to the AI loop or evolving the context over time. All of that becomes very important instead of just being an in memory instance.
No, makes sense. Makes sense. And for our audience, just to reiterate, you can access the blog on context engineering, and also request a meeting with the analyst. I'm sure there are a lot of questions that we are not able to answer today, and I just want to make sure that we are able to address those separately for you. So feel free to take advantage of this opportunity, and happy to kind of discuss and answer some of those questions separately. So again, thank you, Ross and Mansi, for joining. This was a very insightful conversation. Thank you everyone who joined us today and shared your perspectives in the comments, and look forward to having a meeting with some of you as well later on. And just to again bring that question up, I would really love to see some comments around workflows in your organization which are data rich but still context poor. So keep sharing your thoughts in the comments, and please can follow us on LinkedIn. You can reach out to us separately as well on LinkedIn. We're happy to kind of connect with you. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your stay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.